About 8 months ago, I bought this, the Mirka RS, and I think it's a really interesting tool. Why? Because this is a rotary sander. Obviously there are hundreds, if not thousands, of random orbital disc sanders, which are designed to do both a rotational motion, meaning the disc spins, but also an orbital motion. So if you can imagine something like this. And that dual motion of the sanding pad basically means that it never follows the same path twice, preventing repetitive sanding scratch marks and therefore resulting in a better finish to the human eye. There are also loads of orbital sanders on the market, also known as sheet sanders, and those have sanding pads that orbit, but they don't rotate. Great for finish sanding, polishing, but material is removed slowly and gently. And then there are geared random orbit sanders like the ones by Festool, Makita and Bosch, possibly some others too, and they are designed to handle everything from aggressive sanding to finish sanding all in one machine. But they tend to be quite heavy and cumbersome to control in my experience. And I actually owned one of the earlier Bosch models several years ago now, but I ended up sending it back for that very reason. This sander though has a sanding pad which rotates, but it doesn't orbit. And if I was going to compare its performance to any other sander, it would be a belt sander. Belt sanders are designed for extremely aggressive removal of material and are typically used for rough work, where a fine finish or good level of precision is not needed. So for example, stripping wood of paint, or maybe taking a rough sawn board and getting it smoother, removing any splintery bits. In many ways though, this is way better than a belt sander. Although having said that, it's not perfect either. So let's take a look at it. But first, I bought this tool with my own money, but I did receive a discount from Mirka. I have no affiliation with Mirka and they are not aware that I'm making this video. Is a belt sander faster though? Let's test it out. My workbench is in need of a refresh. As you can see, there's lots of dried up glue and stains. And this is actually one of the main reasons that I bought the RS in the first place. So I'm just going to divide the workbench into two halves. And then to make sure I do a thorough job, I'm just going to mark up some pencil lines so that I can better see when the surface has been fully sanded. I'll put a fresh disc on the RS. This is an 80 grit disc. I'll also put a brand new 80 grit belt on the belt sander. And just by the way, this particular belt sander takes the bigger 100mm wide belts. I think the more common belt sanders are the 75mm wide ones, like this Bosch, which I was going to use in this experiment, but unfortunately I don't have any 80 grit belts for this at the moment. Now it's worth pointing out here that the left side of the bench does look a bit messier in this image, but it doesn't affect things really, as it's the pencil marks I'm looking at removing here. I noticed a lot of things during this comparison, which I'll talk more about later in the video, but the key thing to note here is that the RS took just 41 seconds to sand this half of the workbench. The belt sander, however, took 2 minutes and 24 seconds, 3 times as long, in other words. And not only that, but it didn't leave a surface that I was particularly happy with, so I ended up going over it again with the RS. So the RS clearly wins here, but the second reason I think it's superior is the finish quality. You might be thinking that because the sanding pad doesn't have that orbital motion to randomize the sanding scratches, that the finish quality would be terrible. And while I certainly wouldn't opt to use it for finish sanding, the quality of finish it leaves is surprisingly good. Belt sanders are notorious for leaving really aggressive sanding scratches, best minimized by sanding in the direction of the wood grain, but they can also leave dips and gouges in the material, particularly if you're not being careful with how you are holding the tool and moving it around the workpiece. The rotational scratch pattern from the RS is actually far superior. So impressive in fact that when I sanded back the reclaimed oak floor of my garden room, using 80 grit discs by the way, I felt no need to go back and do any finish sanding here. Obviously it would be different if this was a piece of furniture. After a few coats of varnish, it turned out fantastic, and I think even if you got close to the floor, the sanding scratches still aren't noticeable. If, for example, I was cleaning up a rough board with a belt sander and then moving on to finish sanding with a random orbital sander, I'd need to do a lot more finish sanding to get it to a standard where I would be happy with it. However, if I was using the RS for the rough sanding and then moving on to finish sanding, I could get that board to a much better quality of finish much quicker. It's much easier to keep the sanding pad flat to the workpiece to avoid sanding any gouges or dips. Yeah, the finish it leaves is just generally smoother and a finer finish. Thirdly, ergonomics. The RS is just much easier to control than any belt sander that I've ever used. And I've owned a lot of them over the years, by the way. Belt sanders are usually quite big, heavy and unwieldy. And with that lack of control, you're less likely to be able to sand a surface using any level of precision. I'm not saying though that the RS is easy to control. it is a tool where you are going to want to use two hands to control it most of the time. Having said that, my friend Leo over at the Hand I Craft channel uses this sander with one hand. And that's because if you're not familiar with Leo's backstory, he very sadly lost the use of his dominant arm in a car accident. But yeah, generally the DROS RS is just more ergonomic and easier to control than a belt sander. Fourthly, and perhaps most importantly in my opinion, sanding with the DROS RS with the dust shroud attached and a vacuum connected means that you'll basically have a completely dust-free sanding experience most of the time. If, for example, you're sanding a wide flat surface anyway. If you were sanding the face of a narrow board or the edge of a board, for example, you will still get some dust escaping. But this dust shroud does an incredible job. By comparison, hooking up a dust extractor to a belt sander has always resulted in disappointment in my experience. The footage that you're about to see is with dust extraction connected, and just look at the amount of dust that spews up even on startup before the tool hits the workpiece. The design of the belt sander just doesn't lend itself well to effective dust collection. It just wants to throw dust everywhere and at great speed. And look at the workbench once I'd finished sanding. And reason number 5, noise. This is the noise of the DROS RS with no dust extraction. It is whisper quiet. And now the belt sander. And this is me talking over it. Here I've got a sound meter app and I will run each sander at distance of 1 meter. So that's 47 decibels. And that's about 74. Because decibels are logarithmic, that means the belt sander is 6.5 times louder in perceived loudness. Now, I mentioned the dust shroud earlier, and that brings me to my first complaint with this tool. When I first got it out of the box, I followed the instructions in the manual to fit the dust shroud, powered on the sander momentarily, and it instantly damaged and kind of melted some of the plastic at the back of the sander where the dust port is. Obviously I was pretty devastated because this was a brand new tool that I hadn't even used yet. I contacted Mirka, who pointed me in the direction of one of their online videos explaining how to fit the shroud correctly. And I will say it was a very good video, I'll leave a link to it in the description. The problem though is that the manual didn't explain it anything like the video. Now I'm not sure if I'm the only person who fitted the dust shroud incorrectly, but my guess would be that Mirka probably got quite a few returns, messages and phone calls about this problem. And in fairness to Mirka, they took my comments on board and have since updated the manual to give much better wording, which I think will resolve the issue for 99% of people. They offered to collect the sander, have it repaired by their service centre and return it to me, and at no cost to me, so obviously I was very happy with that. Unfortunately though, and I assume because it was a relatively new tool out on the market, replacement components didn't seem to be readily available. It took quite a few emails and phone calls and about 6 weeks of chasing until they decided to just send me a brand new DROS RS. So that's what happened, and here's the footage of me fitting it. The key thing is to get it stretched over the sanding pad first, and then align the arrow on the shroud and snap it in place, which is actually still quite tricky as it's a tight fit, but I managed to get it on there eventually, and since then it's done a great job. Also worth mentioning that you really need to use a pad saver for this tool because a lot of dust will get trapped in the Velcro on the sanding pad. So in the long run, these will save you a lot of money because these are a lot cheaper than replacing the actual backing pad of your sander. Then you get your disc fitted, and as with every tool that creates dust in my workshop, I added a CTS quick click adapter. These just allow me to connect every one of my tools to the same vacuum hose. Highly recommended, link in the description. And since then, I've been using this tool way more than I expected to. And that's because, if I'm going to be totally honest, I bought this tool for the wrong reasons. The right reason for buying a tool, in my opinion, is because it's something that you're going to use a lot. But I bought this tool because I was offered a good deal on it and because I thought it was interesting. I really thought it was going to be one of those tools that I just tucked away in a cupboard and it came out maybe 2 or 3 times a year because that's what my belt sanders did. But I've just found so many more practical uses for the RS than I ever expected to. So much so that I've even built a little shelf for it so that it sits right next to my workbench next to the DROS. There are a few other negative things to comment on as well. The first being that I'm not really much of a fan of how the buttons work. There's the power on button and the speed controller buttons, that's fine. But to start the tool, you can either hold down the rotate button, and let's be honest, nobody's really going to be doing that, are they? It's just going to be too uncomfortable. Alternatively, you can press the rotate button and then the lock button within 1 second. I understand that it's like this for safety reasons, but I'm not really a fan of that. There is also a ramp up mode, which can be turned on by pressing the plus and minus buttons together. And in that mode, the harder you press down on the tool, the faster it spins. And I'm not a fan of that either, so I just stick to the normal mode. And to stop the tool, you can either press the standby button, or the lock button, or the rotate button. which is fine. Another thing that could be considered as a negative for this tool is that you're going to be going through a lot more sanding discs than you would sanding belts if using a belt sander. By way of comparison, this is the belt that I used from new for sanding half of the workbench earlier in the video. There's still plenty of life left in this, it feels sharp and ready to be put back to work. And this is the sanding disc that I used on the RS. This doesn't feel sharp at all and it's destined for the bin. When I was sanding the salvaged oak floor of my garden room, I reckon I got through between 8 and 10 sanding discs. Had I been using the belt sander, I reckon I probably could have done the whole thing with either 1 or 2 sanding belts. But I dread to think how much longer it would have taken. The final negative to mention is that it's a pretty expensive tool. I'm not going to mention prices here because prices change all the time, and if I say a price now, tomorrow it'll probably be different. But I will leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. I think the Diros RS's main competitors are probably the Festool Rotex, as well as the Makita and Bosch models, but they really are very different tools in the way that they feel to use. I much prefer the rotary only motion. The geared random orbit sanders are great if you want an all-in-one tool that does everything, but it is going to feel like a more cumbersome tool to use, whereas the RS really is a one-trick pony. Aggressive rotary sanding is really all it does. When I first got this tool, what I would have expected to say at the end of this video would have been, if you do a lot of rough work, sanding scaffold boards, pallet wood, wood with metal in, then this could be a better alternative than the belt sander. But it costs a lot of money and you'll go through a lot of sanding discs. And I also thought I'd probably say, I'm not totally convinced that it was worth me buying it. However, having used it way more often than I ever expected to, and having done that side-by-side comparison with the belt sander earlier in the video, I have to say I absolutely love this tool, and now having experienced using it, I wouldn't be without it. And if it breaks after the warranty ends, I will absolutely buy a new one, even if it means paying full price. Thank you for watching.